Hello, this is Mark Sabatella from Outside Shore Music. In this video, I'm going to talk some about the melody to a very beautiful composition by the late Benny Golson. This tune is called I Remember Clifford. Before I talk about that, I just will say a couple words about Benny, who just died a couple days ago as I record this. He's a great saxophonist and composer who is really one of the elder statesman of jazz who was still with us, one of the two, until just this week now, remaining people from this very famous photograph known as A Great Day in Harlem, in which all of these jazz musicians were photographed on a street corner. And until recently, Benny Golson and Sonny Rollins were the only two left alive, and now Sonny is the only one left. But anyhow, Benny, a really great composer in the jazz idiom, just very tuneful. And so we're going to be looking at one of his most famous and one of his most tuneful compositions, I Remember Clifford. And I just want to talk about how much he gets out of developing of a few motifs. I'll talk about a couple other things as they come up, perhaps, but mostly we're dealing with how this beautiful composition that's kind of a sprawling form develops out of just a few motifs. So I'm going to kind of play bits of it and talk, play and talk. So here's the introduction to the piece. So that is the introduction. I'm playing it a little faster than people would normally play it, just to, in the interest of time, I guess. So we have this motif. That's the original, the first theme we hear. Then we hear, well, that is kind of a transposed and simplified version, right? The original version is this arpeggio up. This is also an arpeggio up. The original version has a couple extra notes. And the second version just has. But either way, it reaches that high point and then comes down, right? So it's a simplified version of that motif. Then we get. Well, that's like yet another simplification of the motif. Here we don't get an entire seventh chord being arpeggiated. It's a constricted in range version, but it's still the case that we hit that long note at the top or the high note in the middle of the measure and then kind of come down to the final note of that phrase. So this is like three different variations on that motif. So now here comes kind of the main theme of the piece. It's a lot of pieces in the jazz world are this sort of AABA form, and so there's really only two 8-bar melodies. The A section that happens 3 times, and then a B section. This piece, as I said, is a bit more of a sprawling form. But I am going to play like 4 bars at a time. So here comes the first 4 bars of the main theme. So I'm playing the chords that I see here on the chart. This is from the real book from Hal Leonard. I'm hesitating a little bit because I sometimes play these chords a little differently when I've played the piece, but I'm trying to be relatively faithful to what I see on here. I probably learned it wrong. So anyhow, we have this melody, which itself is, again, kind of based on that theme. Bum, boom, right? It's bum and then bum. It's this motif that starts on a high note, comes down a third, and has some stuff going into it. You might be looking at this and going, come on, is this really related? Well, yes. I'm, without claiming to speak for Benny Golson, this is how jazz musicians think. We play a motif and it reminds us of something, especially when we're improvising. We don't necessarily repeat a motif exactly. We capture some essence of what about it stuck with us. And this is exactly the sort of variations that you expect from an improvising mind. But here it's just set down to paper. So it's yet another simplification of that idea. So now the next phrase, this is also is almost in some vague way an inversion of, here it's ascending, right? This line is ascending. The other lines have all descended from their high point down to the final note. This one is the first phrase we've had that actually ascends. So in a sense, it's got some of the same shape to it, but it's, you know, it's got a long note at the beginning of the phrase, just like the first measure did, and it's got some, you know, it's eighth notes here rather than quarter note triplets, but it's got some motion. But here the motion is basically pulling us down, and here the motion is pulling us up. All right, so now the next phrase we get, there's a motif. Now that's the same thing, right? And now that. So definitely total sequencing of that same motif. So again, starting with the pickups into that first ending. Now here's that same motif, but this time it goes somewhere a little different. It doesn't have that little triplet figure. It doesn't have that fast triplet figure, right? That at the end, but it still has that quarter note triplet figure, which again is referencing the quarter note triplet in the first bar of the measure of that whole theme. Again, this kind of stuff is semi-conscious when improvising. A lot of melodies like this start off as improvisations and then are sort of refined and written down. This very much has that character. All right, then that whole melody repeats, at least those first four, but now there's a different second ending. So that first ending has that. Here comes the second ending. So here again he's sequencing, but it's a shorter sequence, right? In the first ending, it's a two bar. It's basically that ascending line, and it takes a full 2 bars before he gets to the repetition of that idea. But in the second ending, he gives us, and then immediately he gives us that repetition, right? Now here's some more kind of sequencing. Right? It's just this little descending thing. It's descending in fifths, basically. Perfect fifth, diminished fifth, perfect fifth, and it finishes with a third instead of a fifth. But it's all that same rhythm, right? That dotted quarter eighth rhythm. So it's, or I should say eighth into the dotted quarter. The eighth is kind of a pickup. Pick up into the note, pick up into the note, pick up into the note, pick up into that note, right? So it's just a very short little motif being then, I could call it sequence. Is it technically a sequence or is it something a little different? It's just repeating with some variations with different pitch levels. All right, let's go on. Just in that little phrase, this is a beautiful little phrase, but again, that's exactly what we heard in both the first ending and the second ending. I shouldn't say exactly, but extremely related, right? Going into the first ending, we heard. Going into the second ending, we heard. So we heard that phrase, and now we're hearing. And we get the D flat. So he gives us a D natural in that first ending. He gives us a D flat in the second ending. Here in this kind of bridge, this B section, he's giving us both the D and the D flat, but it's still that same E flat resolving down to D, the same chord progression there, A minor 7 to D7, this little 2-5-1 into G minor. So he is further developing that idea. The next thing, well, this is exactly that phrase from the introduction, right? I mean, so he's reusing that, but then it's got its own little sequence. Motif, and then again, sequence isn't technically exactly the right word. It's a repetition of that motif, but with a different final note. And then he's got this little leap up there. All right, going on. This phrase feels connected to everything else. I mean, I could tear it apart and say, oh, look, he used this little combination of notes that used somewhere else. But maybe this is the most different, like that little descending sequence. Stepwise descending. We haven't really seen that, right? We've seen all these other little variations, right? We've seen all those sorts of things, and right, we've seen all these little eighth note patterns into downbeats, but never just a plain descending pattern like we get there. So it's like a new motif, but now, well, first of all, that motif, again, that's that motif that got us into the first ending. But now here, let me start this phrase again. Now he borrows that little motif, and he gives us that descending line here again. So this phrase is basically built out of two motifs he's given us before. That exact motif he gave us before in that exact key, and is the same motif he used here. The same motif he gave us 2 bars earlier, but now transposed up a fifth. So, you see what I mean about how much mileage he's getting out of just a few motifs, but by kind of recombining them in different ways and transposing them, altering things about them. And now we have that little phrase, just kind of an arpeggio. It's vaguely reminiscent of, right? It's reminiscent of things we've heard before. It feels like it fits, even if we've never seen that exact pattern before. And at that point, we get a return to that kind of A section. Now here it's a little different. So just think about that little difference. This phrase is exactly what we get going into both the first and second ending. Remember, the first ending was, the second ending was, and then in the bridge we got, in this version we have just a slight different, actually no, this isn't even that different. I take it back. That's exactly, it's exactly this, except they spelled the chord wrong in the second ending. They say G minor 7, but it's really G minor 7 flat 5. So this is exactly the second ending. Sorry if I started to steer you wrong. That final A section is essentially the same as the second ending, but then it's got, which is the same way the second ending went, except the second ending, ended not on a final tonic note. It kind of ended on scale degree 5 to feel not so final. This one, that feels a little more final, right? It's not totally final. That's the end of the tune. But just for completeness sake, you notice there is a two coda here. At the end of the whole performance, after solos and everything, there is an ending on it, which is basically the intro. So when they play the final melody, here comes the coda. So it's that same melody, but instead of ending on a one chord like he did back here, he's ending on a three chord and then going somewhere different. That's not quite how that chord should be voiced, but now here comes essentially the intro again. So that's exactly all the material we've heard before in the intro. And then just a little quarter note triplet to finish it. The lyrics that are put to it are "Remember Clifford Brown?" So there's like a couple extra notes in the ending in the vocal versions of this that are pretty commonly done as well. So anyhow, I look at this melody as really being kind of a master class in developing of motifs in a highly complex and sophisticated way. Sometimes I'll look at other tunes that are really just based on one motif and repeating that with variations. This is a lot more subtle than that. He's got like 2 or 3 different motifs that he's using and then combining them in different ways. It's really it's very improvisational, I guess, in its approach, and it just all works. It's a gorgeous piece. Highly recommend checking out recording of it. I will include a link to it in the description here. So anyhow, I Remember Clifford by the late Benny Golson.